Yeah, I guess I'll pray, read the text, and we'll get going. Father, we thank you once again just for the day of enjoying your word, of getting to be in Daniel, and think about how these few weeks in Daniel have shaped us, have spoken to us, have encouraged us, have challenged us. Lord, now as we come to this passage in Luke, we pray that you use it ultimately for your glory. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
This is Luke 21, verses 5 through 9. And while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, "As for these things, you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And then they asked him, "Teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" And he said, "See that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once." This is the word of the Lord. Now, for those of you that know me well, you know that I love movies, and you also know that I can be a little pretentious about them. I like good movies, objectively good movies. I do have one guilty pleasure, though, and that is the genre of disaster movies. No matter how bad they are, if it's a disaster movie, I am probably going to give that company my $15. In fact, I saw 2012 in theaters, not even opening night, but at midnight. I will argue that Independence Day is objectively one of the greatest movies ever made, and its sequel is most certainly one of the worst. I think the thing that I and others love about disaster movies is this. You end up thinking, what would I do in that situation? Over the next few weeks, we're entering into this section of Luke where Jesus is talking to his disciples about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which would occur in 70 AD. It's an event that's not going to occur for a few decades from when Jesus is telling these disciples. And for us, it is obviously an event that has happened centuries before we were even born. And while there are many aspects to this conversation that we'll go over in the next few weeks, it largely focuses around this. In this situation, and these type of disaster situations, what should followers of Jesus do? How are they to respond, react, and represent Jesus in such circumstances? The truth of the matter is that the way Jesus and the rest of the Bible portrays it, the church is always living in a perilous time. These are not simply instructions for those then. It's not simply instruction for Christians that happen to be here when Jesus returns. Instead, these are teachings from Jesus, instructions for his church, then, now, and throughout history, whether that history is before or after us. How the church ought to live is a conversation at hand in times of uncertainty, pressures, and dangers. In fact, if I could title this whole section of scripture, not just our passage this morning, it would be How to Live in Perilous Times. This morning is part one. Like any good disaster movie, we'll have a few of them. And though we're only looking at the first few verses this morning, it's a rather lengthy conversation. If you look down the rest of your Bible, you're going to notice a lot of red. And you know when there's this long conversation that you're having with somebody and it's a lot of twists and turns, and then you're trying to reconstruct how did this whole thing happen? Where were we in conversation? How did we get here? Well, if we look at verse 5, that's the beginning of this conversation. That's where everything starts. Look at it again. Some of them were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings. The whole conversation starts with people looking at the temple that they're standing next to and talking about its beauty and grandeur. Jesus is just like, yeah, that's cool and all, but none of it's going to be standing very long. And you have to understand, for the Jews at that time that were actually there and heard this, it's hard to imagine that thing will be gone. The sheer size of it, but also it's their national, ethnic, and religious identity. Their pride was wrapped up in this thing. It was a sign of God's favor on Israel. It was a sign of God's might. And if that thing was gone, well, what else would be left standing? It most certainly would have to be the end of the world if that thing is gone. God must be bringing his judgment upon Israel and the world at large. It'd be like if I told you that the White House and the Capitol building are in absolute ruins. You wouldn't just assume that those things are gone and everything else is okay. You would assume that we're at total war, that America is on the verge of complete destruction, and as a party favor, we sent off all of our nukes to the rest of the world. Everything would be coming down, not just those buildings. There's no way to fathom such an event outside of the idea of a complete and total apocalypse. So naturally, Jesus says this, and the disciples are like, well, when is this going to happen? Because that would be rather important information to have. And what will be the signs so we know when this thing is actually going to happen? I mean, even if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, I imagine you're slightly curious as to what Jesus's answer is to this question. But I mean, what does Jesus say about when the world is going to end and all that? And if you look at our passage this morning, I'm sure you'll notice that Jesus doesn't really answer that question, does he? Jesus tends to do that sometimes. Doesn't really answer the question at hand. He redirects it to something that he thinks, therefore we should think, is a much greater priority. Instead, Jesus simply gives this command in verse 8. Read it again with me. See that you are not led astray. The command isn't simply not to go astray, and it simply isn't either not to be led astray, but to see to it. There's a proactiveness that is required of the church if they are to not go astray. There's a sense that we're to be on guard for ourselves and for one another. To boil down these first 4 verses and how to live in perilous times, it would simply be this. As things fall, be vigilant not to go off course. Jesus highlights 2 traps that we are to avoid that might steer us off course in the midst of these catastrophic events. In fact, instead of signs of when it's going to happen, Jesus is giving warnings of false signs that might trip us up. 2 pitfalls that, given the nature and the situation, we might not otherwise be as susceptible to, but here we are. First, pitfalls of following fakers. Again, look at verse 8 with me. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. So it's easy to read the, I am he, and think that Jesus is warning us that people will come and be like, yo, I am actually Jesus reincarnated. And I don't know if you've met people in our society today who do that. They most often come off as very cheap con men or people with serious mental health issues. Mm-hmm. So I don't think many of us would be tempted to follow somebody who's claiming to be Jesus reincarnated. But I don't think either that Jesus is simply saying, watch out for people who are claiming to be me, Jesus. Jesus is warning not to follow other people who claim to be the Messiah. Now, again, in our day, this probably doesn't seem like a revolutionary idea to you. You probably haven't had that many people who legitimately claim to be the Messiah. But in their day, well, it's very common for Jews to have these different leaders that would rise up and claim to be the Messiah. They would claim to be the political and religious leader that would throw off the secular pagan government of Rome, that would establish the kingdom of God for all his faithfully and morally righteous people. This is what the Messiah was promised to do. So for a minute, think about being an early Christian. Rome's still in power. God's kingdom hasn't yet come. Jesus said he was the Messiah, and he seemed to do some good things and move the ball perhaps down the field, but not everything has come to fruition that the Messiah promised he would do. So was he really the Messiah or the only one? Did his mission perhaps fail? Again, given our historical context, we don't meet as many people who claim to be the Messiah. You probably haven't met that guy. We do have those, though, who say they have some unique position in leading God's people and in leading God's people into the next stage of history. That they have some special connection with God, some special knowledge and understanding that has uniquely positioned them to lead us further. Once again, their rallying cry is the time is at hand. It's time to establish God's kingdom fully and forever, overthrowing these secular pagans. And they will bring that community of God's people into a glorious age of triumph, all on the wings of consuming zeal. This is the false claims that we hear today. I've met that guy. Perhaps you've met that guy, if only on YouTube. Mm-hmm. And he isn't always denying Jesus, is he, right? Jesus says, they're going to come in my name. He isn't always as easy to identify as the guy who's just straight up saying, I am the Messiah. In fact, I would even go as far to say that sometimes their teaching can actually be really appealing. That's why it's an actual, real, and great threat to going off course. They have answers, a plan, and a vision. Full kingdom now. Down with Rome. Down with Babylon. Down with any other human structure that opposes God. Now at our hands, and all in the name of God. So how are we to avoid going astray? First thing is we have to ask and serially examine is, does the teaching of our leaders line up with the teaching of Jesus? These passages are often taught as primarily discussing the when of the end times, the when of Jesus is going to return. And of course, we have a natural curiosity about that. But remember, these passages are not about us figuring out the exact return of Jesus. Jesus even says in Acts 1 that it is not for you to know times or epochs which the Father has fixed by his own authority. So us trying to lock down a specific time is actually antithetical to Jesus' own teaching. Of course, this doesn't mean that we disregard all of the Bible's teaching on the end times. In fact, if we remain purposely ignorant about it, we're not going to have the foundation cemented in us by which we could analyze and critique those false messiahs. So let me ask you, when it comes to fundamental aspects of Christ's return, are you ignorant and therefore gullible? The fastest talker in the room with the best presentation will be able to sway you in 5 minutes because you don't have any grounding. Avoid going astray by knowing the teachings of Jesus, specifically about his return. And then with these fakers, the other thing we have to think of is, does their teaching cause me to follow them at the cost of actually following Jesus? I mean, will I end up inadvertently abandoning Jesus in order to be loyal to them? Because this is the language that Jesus uses. He says, don't go after them. Don't follow them. The implication is that you're no longer following Jesus. And after all, haven't we seen Jesus throughout Luke's gospel calling people to follow him? In the Gospel of Luke, a disciple of Jesus is one who follows him, one who knows him and follows his teachings. Disciples embrace the poor. Disciples welcome the sinner. Disciples show compassion to the broken. Disciples admit their own sin, and they proclaim the forgiveness of sins in Jesus. Anyone else who is leading you away from following Jesus in that manner, have nothing to do with. I hope that's what you hear from this pulpit. If it isn't, or if there's someone else that you might be paying attention to who might sound like they're giving lip service to Jesus, but like the Pharisees, when you step back and actually listen and analyze what they're saying, what their mission is, what their strategy is, you recognize that their hearts are far from him. My plea with you would be to abandon ship before you get off course. Be vigilant in not going after these fakers. This is how we are to live in perilous times. Of course, it isn't just claims of messiahship that can cause us to abandon the true Messiah. In verse 9, Jesus also warns about the fear of war. Reread that with me. And when you hear of wars and tumults, and do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. Fear of war and the panic that comes with it, that is the warning. I mean, in truth, we're all probably experiencing that in a rather fresh way in the past year and a half. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think we're, by and large, very happy to see that Ukraine has been able to defend themselves. But it does make you wonder, how far is this thing going to escalate? I mean, would Putin actually go so far as to use nuclear options? Would that then draw us into it? And what would that mean for our lives, for our families, for the world? I don't know about you guys, but even as a Christian, it kind of makes me a little uneasy thinking about it. I mean, what will happen? Will we be safe? Or will it lead to the end of the world as we know it? To be honest, it's easy to fear and get caught up in the hysteria. So then how does this fear and hysteria, how does it manifest itself in such a way that it would lead us astray? Because again, that's the command, not to go astray. I think fear is a rather interesting thing. It simultaneously reveals something true about ourselves, and yet causes us to act in a way that we wouldn't otherwise. It can expose what our faith is really in, and yet at the same time, we can get swept up in a mob mentality and start to think and do things that we wouldn't do otherwise. I think this is especially important for us as Americans. I mean, we live pretty good lives, pretty comfortable, secure, peaceful lives, which is good. That is a good thing. It does lend us to panicking rather easily at the first sign of those things being threatened. At the beginning of the pandemic, I remember seeing this tweet, and it essentially said, war and famine happen all the time everywhere else in the world. We Americans have to stay inside with the AC on and watch a Netflix for a month, and we're convinced it's a sign of the end of the world. When we think it's the end of our worlds as we know it, let alone the world, don't be fooled into thinking you're immune from panic. Otherwise, we might actually find ourselves in the spot where we're saying, forget this whole Jesus thing, and just acting like a bunch of rats fleeing that sinking ship. Being impulsive and doing whatever we might need to do to survive. So how are we going to be vigilant and not being swept away in the fear of war? Essentially, it boils down to this question that you have to ask yourself. Do you believe God's in control or not? And not just did you sign our statement of faith, or do you read John Calvin to your kids at night as a testament to your belief in God's sovereignty? But as things fall, as things in your world fall, as things around the world fall, in our country fall, someday the whole thing falls. Do you and will you stay the course? When things fall, does it produce a consuming and overwhelming fear, or faith in a sovereign and faithful God? I recently heard this, it stuck with me. Faith and fear are both a response to recognizing our lack of control. They are responding to the same thing. Obviously, they are going in different directions. It's simply a question of, do you turn to God as the one in control, or panic like those who do not know God? Vigilance and seeing that we do not go astray, of not going off course, is recognizing when we are actually tempted to fear, and instead choosing to trust in the one who's in control. That's what Jesus is teaching his followers then, in the shadow of that temple. That's what he's teaching us now. That's what he's taught the church throughout history. It does make you ask, though, well, why trust that Jesus knows what he's talking about? I mean, does he actually have any control over this, or is he just kind of saying that? A few days before this, he entered Jerusalem and he told his men to go find a colt. He gave them the details of how it would unfold. It's a rather small story. It's an interesting one. He gives them the details of when you go here, you're going to have this conversation, say this, say this. And it all goes exactly as Jesus said it would. It's a small story with a big message. Jesus is going into Jerusalem and he knows how everything's going to happen. And he's in control of it all. Actually, even before getting to Jerusalem, Jesus spent weeks traveling there, and he spent those weeks predicting that when he got there, he would be handed over and crucified. Guess what happened? Everything went exactly as he said it would. Jesus was not only aware of what was going to happen, but he was indeed orchestrating it. Then 3 days later, when he raises from the dead, he runs into these two guys that thought Jesus was the Messiah before his execution. And these two guys, they don't recognize this resurrected Jesus, so they begin telling him what happened in those past few days. If you turn just a few pages to Luke 24, look at verses 18 through 24 with me. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And Jesus, or he, being Jesus, said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who would redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning. They did not find his body. They came back saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Did you catch what they said in verse 21? But we hope that this was the one to redeem Israel. They were at a loss. They had put their hopes that Jesus was this actual promised Messiah, but with his death, with the powers of the world seemingly still in power, they were kind of left with the conclusion that Jesus was a godly man, but a failed Messiah. Probably didn't really have control over anything. Next few verses, verse 25, Jesus responds to them. And he said to them, O foolish ones, how slow to heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into glory? He began with Moses and all the prophets, interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Jesus is saying to them that everything that has happened was always planned. My coming, my death, my resurrection, never was it out of control. It was always the plan to bring the kingdom. It was always the plan to bring the kingdom through a crucified and risen Savior. The one who knew that he could go to death because he could defeat death. He's the one who is worthy of our trust and belief that he is absolutely in control. So how do we live in a perilous time? What do you do in that disaster situation? We might not have every plot point, but we have the major beats of the story. And Jesus certainly has given us our lines to follow. So in that perilous time that we live in, that the people of God have always lived in, stay on script and don't go off course. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the truth that there are always going to be times in which we feel the tug and the pull to go astray, but that you have given us truth to hold on to so that we do not have to be wandering fearfully, chasing after leaders that would lead us astray. That even in the midst of the turmoil that our personal worlds, our world at large is in, we can be confident that you are in control. Pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. Amen.
All right, Dave, how are you encouraged as you prepared the sermon?
I would say that I definitely watch the news too much. It's, I mean, like, honestly, in my lifetime, it's like, okay, 9/11, 08, but like as a full-blown adult, like this is the first time where it's like, what is actually going on in the world? And how long can we, play Russian roulette, so to speak?
Okay. And what was the encouragement?
Oh, that God's, that God's in control.
Oh,
despite all that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You
Me was encouraged to remind again the very important question: do you believe in God? That God is in control or not? That was encouraging the way that I have to, think about it a lot of time, because sometimes I must, believe that's all. It's something like you have to really know who is God and what He is doing now in this moment, even when people try to figure out how it's going on, that's
Nothing.
Yeah, I was just encouraged in regards to how to avoid going astray. And then your exhortation was really um, intriguing to help me, just not to encourage me, but give me a warning, like how to avoid going astray is to knowing the teaching of Jesus. So that was a good reminder. Just that's how to stay on course and keep on going back to the teachings of Jesus and reflecting on that.
Early on, kind of like in your intro thing before you got to the false signs, just that idea of like, when's this going to go down? And we're all curious. I just realized I'm like, wow, like I'm far more curious about when a lot of the time than like how I should live. And that, yeah, like if we could all know like when it's going to happen, we'd all, like you want to know. But Jesus, what really matters and what Jesus thinks is important, really what we should want to know is how should I live?
Right.
And it's pretty simple. Just don't fall off course. Yeah, that's helpful.
There you go. David, how were you encouraged in the sermon?
Can I go last?
Yes,
I think there's just a lot of fear out there in the world, and you brought that reality out. But yet it's like looking back at the other passage in Luke, he's got a plan all along. God's got a plan, and it's just be steady, steadfast, trust in Him.
Okay, so I think your explanation, so I'm going to some details specific. Your explanation of the historical background of the Israel and temple is like their national symbol. Like those things are really working really well, impressed me. So bring me back into first century in Palestine or Israel. So that's really good. Yep.
Great. Yeah, I think what was most kind of just encouraging to me was the fact that, like, it is confusing, right? Like, you didn't downplay the fact that, hey, this is not an easy time to be alive, which I think was good. What's one place you think you missed? A place that you need probably to improve on this thing?
I really, well, one, ran out of time, but two, like, not, other than, like, you're probably curious if you're a non-believer. Like, there was no place that I connected with a non-believer. I was hoping to kind of throw some in at the gospel connection, but at the same time, I didn't feel, even if I did that, if I had time to do that, I didn't feel strong about how to connect this passage to the non-believer.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I don't know if you have missed that, but I was thinking about the original context before that passage. I was thinking about how you can deal with that in order to, because for one reason, Luke put that story in that moment. I just think about it. Maybe we can think more how to relate this country, because you did a great job after that. But I was thinking about before that verse, how or the whole chapter before that,
Right.
how related with this event, in order to understand more.
Gene?
Yeah, at the beginning there, I wasn't really sure which one was your main point. It sounded like there's in disastrous situation, what should followers of Jesus do? Just that. As things fall, be vigilant, not to go off course. So, which one were you tackling? So it's just confusing there at the beginning. Maybe arrangement piece on there.
Good. Christian.
So I think maybe to that, like to the going over time, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear why you kind of think you went long. But to me, like, I hope this is helpful. I don't know like how helpful this is going to be. But just the whole thing, it just didn't feel tight.
Yeah.
I felt like there's a lot of kind of fluff and some organizational, not like huge organizational things. Like, I mean, the kind of the intro it was an interesting way to start it by doing almost like a semi-inductive kind of weird thing. But just the whole sermon felt like there was a little more than needed to be there. So I think just like general kind of editing, cut stuff out, cut stuff down, slim it down. Because your sermon this morning was very tight. And this one, the passage is shorter and in some sense like pretty simple. And yet it's still like, oh wow, we went long. So
Josh.
I think for the it's similar to that. Like the intro took a while to get to the point. I thought like it just took quite a while to get to kind of the main point. And then like you were sort of like in the signs as like the first exegetical part. I mean, you did mention. Well, you mentioned the temple later, maybe, but I felt like we were already on verse 7 by the time you started your first point. And I guess I was confused as far as when is your first point, et cetera. Like when are your homiletical points? So, yeah.
Right.
Two very quick points. So first one, we heard you mention pitfalls, right? Pitfall 1, 2, and maybe 3. And so the specific, so after pitfalls you give, so what should we do? Say, be diligent, check it out about those false prophets, like those. So I think pit 1, 2, 3, pitfall, those, maybe you can be like more specific. What's the difference between those solutions for different pitfalls?
Okay.
And
Hold on, save it, because we're gonna do 2 rounds. We're gonna come back to you.
okay.
Yeah. Put that one in your back pocket. Yeah, so here's what I would say, it's kind of to pile on everybody else's. But there wasn't a lot to hang on to in this sermon, and you didn't help us out because like you didn't really call back to anything. So I'm with Christian where it was like it's a lot of information. It wasn't bad, it was like generally in the air, but it was just like, okay, that was a good sentence. Should I put that sentence in my pocket? Or should I just put it on the ground? Like, where am I putting this thing? And so there was just, it felt like I was carrying, like, instead of a couple of bags of groceries, I was just carrying like 100 loose grapes.
Good grapes. Juicy grapes.
Juicy grapes. But grapes. You on?
In your gospel connection, I think that you waste time with some specific text that you try to explain it. Maybe you need to think more which one and just explain a little bit about it and then to go forward, go there. Specifically in the last verse that you quote, I think that what you want to demonstrate with your gospel connection through this text, it related with the text, and then go forward, because sometimes is you spend time in one side of the gospel connection that you don't need it to do. Just focus and that's it.
Just to echo Josh's comments, it's because in the morning you gave us up front, okay, let's rule, restoration, retribution. But this one, it would have been better if you told us up front, okay, this is where we're gonna start or whatever. Because you started with your first analytical point was from verse 8. It would have been better if you could have told us where you were going. So it's like a signpost.
Yeah, maybe even if because you built a lot, then to be fair, you had a lot to build in there. But it might have even been better to be like, no, there's just 2 pitfalls we're going to talk about or whatever.
Mm.
That's the way you're going to do it. But before we get there, I actually have to explain like why this is even being said, what's happening in order to get to somewhere to like kind of say like, hey, I know we're going to get there in a minute.
Yeah.
Some way of just marking that thing off.
Right.
Even though you don't have to name it too big, it's like I want to talk about these like pitfalls in light of this. Why does that thing exist? Well, the first half of this text actually gets told us. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's good. So I think maybe some of this gets to unbeliever, some of this gets to just like kind of feeling a little vague. But I feel like there was some like assumed tension or like implied tension. So like I get that things are going to fall apart, and that we need to be careful to stay with Jesus. But it wasn't clear like what happens if we don't stay with Jesus.
Yeah.
Which like I felt for you because it's not exactly in your text, but you're definitely warning us like don't fall away from Jesus.
Right.
But it's not clear like
What's at stake?
what's at stake. Which I think again for the non-believer, this actually matters for you because of I thought your main point was going to be more like as things fall, be careful not to fall with them or something like that. But yeah, I think some sort of the stakes, the tension, the like, what happens if you don't do this?
Right.
Yeah.
Similar to Yvonne's, just with the gospel connection, I just felt like it was too long in chapter 24. Like you could just use it more quickly. Like you don't have to necessarily have us turn there. I liked the move. I think it was a good move.
Yeah.
It's just that. What are you going to do when you get to chapter 24 then? You know, I feel like you were exegeting that text in a way because you're going to 2 places in it.
Preaching a rotation is not my problem.
So,
Now busted out on dude.
Okay, so again, I think we are using.
I think you should repent.
I think we. I will give you some maybe one excuse for some critics, but anyway, so we are using a lot of comparison with this morning you did this, but this afternoon why you didn't. One of my thought would be like this morning you were preaching from Psalms, which is in Old Testament. Now you are preaching in narrative preaching, which is not easy to do. Which sounds like from audience views like a little messy. We're not sure where you are going or that clear. Maybe that's one of the reason. And another comparison with this morning. So this morning I really like your repetition of talk is cheap. That really got impression to my mind. And this afternoon that is lacking. But maybe that's it because of the narrative preaching's
No, that's not what it is.
characteristic.
Because
But
didn't do it.
Don't blame the Bible.
That's right. Never blame the Bible. So I want to just affirm you that there's nearly jack all for unbelievers in this, right? Like it. Now,
Come on, Jeremy. This is your last one. That's the best you got.
yeah. So I hope it haunts you forever. So it was this thing where like I do think that like you didn't speak totally over like their heads necessarily, but it was just like, all right. And I think part of what kind of Christian might have said, like, there's not a lot of risk here, so it's just like avoid these things, avoid this thing. Like I'm thinking, like I'm just going to avoid Christianity because like you're just talking about this weird like end of the world stuff, and I don't believe jack about that temple, and so it was just kind of like, okay, I guess. I mean, there'd be real little reason for me to come back here, mainly because it sounds like it's some weird cult thing, right? It was just like there wasn't a lot like enough intriguing there. Like, oh, okay, well, man, I really didn't pay attention to this.
Yeah.
All right, so what did you do well? Lots of things, I think, but what did you kind of feel like? Well, last time took a swing.
I would hope. I mean, none of you guys have nailed me on it, so I would hope in a rather confusing passage, I navigated some of the waters well enough and simple enough.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm,
Yvonne, what did you do well?
I think that it was really good. How you handled the expression of the or topic of the time, and you said the text is not. You don't care about the time when that is coming, but I don't. You change the coin, the sign of the coin, and then they said, yeah, the Bible talk about the time. I
Yep.
mean, sometimes it's very important, but I think that was really good.
I think you use good story illustrations. For example, like imagine a White House or the Capitol going down. That was a good example there about, or in the pandemic, you read a tweet and then watching Netflix for a month. Or there's like a humor about reading John Calvin. So that's like, those were really helpful. Those were really intriguing to hear.
I thought the way that you dealt with I am he was really good. Like, it's not literally people claiming to be Jesus reincarnated, but it's these Messiah figures, and really that's just anyone who's claiming like, I've got a special connection with God and I'm going to make things all right. If you just follow me, that was good. And then just kind of your helpful questions of like, are they reflecting Jesus? Are they helping you follow Jesus?
Yeah, it was just like a helpful way of thinking through who to follow and not to follow. You got to be aware of these things, and how do you root out false teachers? How do you discern that? That was really practical and helpful.
Yeah, I like your layout. I heard you said pitfall, maybe pitfall number 1, number 2. Maybe you have number 3. I didn't heard. Maybe I missed it. But I like those clear layout because narrative preaching is not easy. It's very helpful to have things laid out really well.
Yeah. So I would say that one of the things you did really well in this sermon is, like the fact that this, like our lives are pretty easy. So you're very much speaking to kind of your audience. Like our lives are pretty easy, so we tend to make like little things big. Jesus is talking about really big things here, and then what to do in light of them. I thought that was pretty good to just kind of confront your audience with the thing of like, look, this is the stuff that like really matters, even though our lives are usually consumed with stuff that's not this. So I thought that was really good.
I think related with that is how you made an application to your audience, specifically the believers. I think that you did a well job in that kindness, because I was thinking, especially when you talk about special leaders or even the pro leaders that in the position of that kind of stuff, and then you apply to us, I think that it was really good, because sometimes people apply the Bible just in the, I said in this way, that they left the text on the heaven and never bring to the earth, to the people,
You did a great. I love the fact that this passage it sounded like a warning, but you just didn't leave us warned, but you encouraged us how to live in light of what's coming. So you ask a question like, so how do we avoid going astray? And you answer it and you give a practical way of following Jesus' teaching, saying like, the one who follows Jesus follows his teaching. And then the second homiletical point also, you like ask a question. So how do we become vigilant in the midst of fear, or fear in the fear of war? And you ask a question, a follow-up question like, do you believe God is in control? So those were helpful, practical ways to think about. It's not just warning, but how do we live in light of that warning? That's helpful.
It's good. But in your second point, I mean, you did a good job of talking about like the fear that could be, but I thought you did a particularly good job when you asked like, okay, so how does that lead us astray? Because that's actually what we're talking about here. And I thought it would have been easy to just like talk about fear, scary times, yada yada, but then you actually get into like, okay, but fear will cause you to act in ways that you wouldn't normally act. So you need to be prepared, especially like, again, for your context, like, are you prepared? Don't assume that you're immune to panic. And are you prepared for that day when things do fall apart? Are you prepared to like deal with that fear, realize that it's going to be there and still live well? Or are you going to be totally blind and just walk right into it? It's good.
Yeah. I do think you got into that world pretty well of the original years, and just how much of a huge thing the temple not being there would have been to them, just for that audience, how it's like the political, like the White House and everything. So yeah.
I like your expression as a whole. Is very clear. It's welcoming. So basically, it's warm. So I think probably you can have when you are giving more suggestions of how to live a better Christian life, you can be more encouraging and warm and just encourage people. Yeah.
So, good Lord, is this better than what you were preaching 2 years ago? So I was thinking, especially, we talked about the introduction being a little long, but it absolutely led into this text and led right into, as Josh was saying, like, why the heck is all this even taking place in the first place? And it wasn't just information; it actually made sense of the thing, like why the temple was so important, and everything. But you begin in like kind of left field, but it absolutely works. This idea of like, I have guilty pleasure, I love disaster movies, and then it's like, why do we love disaster movies? And then that theme, that idea of, well, the end of the world thing is what brings you into this. So it all just worked like seamlessly to the fact like, oh, not only that's why this text exists, but it makes sense of why they would be kind of freaking out in this moment. I thought it worked super well to get into this. So it was like, okay, I know what we're talking about. I'm not just like entertained in the sense of like, I want to hear what you have to say, but I know what we're going to be talking about. And I think it matters. So there you go.
Yeah.